Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the men's division of Snorri Schneer. If you're exploring the idea of earning a degree but aren't sure where to start, you're not the only one. Maybe you're wondering whether your yeshiva credits will count, how to navigate financial aid, or which program actually leads to a career. That's where the men's division of Snorri Schneer can help. With degree paths in accounting, business, ABA, pre-med, psychology, paralegal, special education, and social work, you'll earn a degree from one of their prestigious partner colleges and be supported all the way through. From expert academic advising to a strong group of peers who learn and grow together, the experience is designed to help you succeed. And when you're ready to take the next step, their advisors are there to guide you, helping you choose the program that fits your goals and walking you through every stage of the process. Applications are open now for the fall semester. Visit their website, www.sarash.com, that's SARASCH.com, or call 917-209-8204 to speak with a helpful advisor today. And you can find links and information in the show notes below. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email me svarimchatter@gmail.com or check out the link and information in the show notes. You can also find a link in the show notes to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Svarim, and book deals, as well as the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp status, where I do those, as well as giveaways. And finally, if you can please subscribe and rate and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen, 24/6, Apple, Spotify, and so on. And with that, enjoy this 3 weeks themed episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Martin Goodman, who is Emeritus Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. And we will be discussing Herod, King Herod, and Professor Goodman's new book, Herod the Great, Jewish King in a Roman World, which was published by Yale in their Jewish Lives series. And Herod, maybe listeners may be familiar with him, maybe not. There's a lot to say about Herod, so we'll leave that for the podcast. Thank you, Professor Goodman, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
I'm English, which you can probably hear, and I studied classics at Oxford and did a doctorate in ancient history, which used rabbinic texts for social history, and I spent a time teaching Greek and Roman history at the University of Birmingham, but from 1986, I've been teaching in the University of Oxford.
So how did you become interested in ancient history? And was that specifically, you were interested originally in ancient world history, Roman world history, or were you interested in Jewish history?
No, I think it was general ancient history. And the Jewish stuff only happened because I could read the rabbinic texts and try to find things out from them which people who work in Greek and Latin only found more difficult. So I was sort of moved into it by mistake.
Okay, so let's talk about Herod. Let's go straight to Herod. But I think as a introductory matter, we should discuss the Roman world at the time of Herod's birth and when Herod. We'll get to Herod himself in a minute, but I think just to lay the ground of what's going on in Rome and the Roman Empire, and also in where Herod is born in the land of Israel, what's going on in this time period for the listener, and who are the major players before we get to Herod himself?
Yeah, so you're right that the wider background is crucial for understanding Herod's life. Herod's born in 73 BCE. And it was a time in which the world in which he was living was undergoing huge changes. And those changes were to go on all the way through his life. He died nearly 70 in 4 BC. And a part of the interesting part of studying him is to see how he responded to all these changes going on within his life. Not easy for anybody involved in politics in that period. The main change was that the power of Rome, which begins, of course, as a small city in Italy, had been spreading for the previous 5 centuries from the west to the east. And by the time of Herod's birth, Roman power was just about to start entering the southern Levant, so the area of Syria and Judea, and down towards Egypt. And by the middle of Herod's life, the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean was under Roman control at the point at which the Romans finally conquered Egypt after the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE and the death of Cleopatra.
That's something that occurs during Herod's life, and Herod is involved with somewhat, but we'll get to that. But who are just the major figures, just to name some of the figures in the Roman world when Herod is born and throughout Herod's life, just because they come up again and again and again in Herod's life?
Yes, there are figures who will be sort of familiar to anybody who goes to Shakespeare plays with Romans in them. So Pompey the Great, who conquered Syria and who conquered Jerusalem in 63 BCE. Pompey's great rival, Julius Caesar. And then, most important of all, those who succeeded after Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE on the Ides of March. First, his assassins, Cassius and Brutus, particularly Cassius, who had control over southern Syria and Judea immediately after 44 BCE. And then the opponents of these assassins, Mark Antony's friend Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, and also, most importantly, the heir of Julius Caesar, Octavian, who eventually was to become the Emperor Augustus.
Yeah, and these are figures for anyone who reads your book or knows this time period or throughout this podcast will come up many times. So now let's turn to Herod, who Chazal referred to him as Horus. Listeners may be familiar with him, as you mentioned already, when he's born, but you can say again. So where is Herod born? What's his background? Is he a Jew? Is he not a Jew? And let's talk a little bit about Herod.
Herod was, his dad, Antipater, was Idumean. So it's from Idumea, Edom, the area around Hebron was where the family came from. His mother was an Nabatean Arab, and the Idumeans had been converted to Judaism 2 generations earlier in the 120s or 110s BCE. So was Herod a Jew? The answer is he definitely thought of himself as a Jew and presented himself as a Jew. He's a Jew, but he's not a Judean. And in both Latin and in Greek, this is ambiguous. And so the same term is used for somebody who comes from Judea and somebody who is Judaios or Judeus, who comes from a Jew who lives in the diaspora or elsewhere. And every now and again, the fact he was not Judean was brought up against him. But that he was entitled to think of himself as a Jew doesn't seem to have been an issue in the same kind of way.
Now, you mentioned his father, Antipater, and his father was somewhat of a powerful figure.
Yes. He was powerful partly because he was Idumean. So within the court of the Hasmonean high priest, who ruled over Jerusalem and Judea at the beginning of the first century BCE, Alexander Jannaeus or Yannai, the Hasmoneans ruled over Judea because they were high priests. They go back, of course, to Hanukkah. And to the cleansing of the temple at the time of the revolt of the Maccabees. So that's the family they come from. That's where Yannai came from. And the reason why Antipater, and indeed Antipater's father, Antipas, had power within the Jerusalem court was because they were trusted courtiers of Alexander Jannaeus and then of his Alexander Jannaeus' widow, Shalom Sion, Salome. She trusted Antipas and Antipater precisely because they were Idumean and couldn't be a threat of any kind to her. So they were ministers of the Hasmonean rulers. And that's the background within the Jerusalem court, but as slight outsiders. that's the background to the birth of Herod.
Isn't it ironic that she trusted them because they were no threat, and then eventually Herod especially really destroys the Hashmonaim, he destroys the Hasmonean line.
It is ironic, but it's not clear anybody could have guessed that was going to happen. Any time until the point at which Herod was proclaimed king, which was quite far on in his life. So it's 33 in 40 BCE, and proclaimed king, of course, not by Jews or any kind of sort of mass acclamation, but by the Romans.
Now let's talk about Herod and his youth, and then I will return in a minute for the listeners to, we mentioned the Roman background, but I realized we didn't discuss the Hasmonean background and what's going on in their dynasty, and there's lots of squabbling and fighting really amongst them, and that's going to play a pivotal role here, but we'll turn to that shortly. So let's talk about a little bit more about Antipater and Herod's youth and upbringing.
So he seemed to be brought up mostly in Jerusalem, as far as we know. There were probably family lands in Idumea, but we don't know where in Idumea those lands were. And it was, as Herod was growing up, it was a time of considerable tension within the Hasmonean dynasty, as you say, lots of squabbling. Partly because on Yanai's death, his widow Shalom Sion became queen, unusual in Jewish history. But she couldn't be high priest, of course. So she selected her older son Hyrcanus to be high priest, and her younger son Antigonus was not happy with this, and so there was a civil war on and off all the way through the rule of Shalom Sion. And Antipater helped Shalom Sion and then helped Hyrcanus, and became Hyrcanus's most trusted ally in trying to retain his role as high priest. And that meant that Herod was really born into a time of conflict. It included at one point during the Civil War being sent off by his father Antipater, along with the rest of the family, off to his mother Kipros's family back in Nabatea, so in Petra. So as a kid, Herod was being looked after by his Nabatean relatives, who we don't know much about them, which is odd, really, because he was to have very close relations with the Nabateans once he became king in later life.
So essentially and just like you said, there was civil war on and off, but there was a back and forth of the kingship and the Kohen Gadol, and the high priesthood was flipping back and forth. So it was between Hyrcanus, as Hyrcanus, and it was Aristobulus or Antigonus, who the names that get confusing. Who was the other, was the opponent?
What a good question. Aristobulus, isn't it? Yeah, it's Aristobulus who was the his opponent. So Hyrcanus and Aristobulus were the two sons of Shalom Sion. And it's Aristobulus who kept on trying to get the high priesthood back off him, until eventually the whole thing was sorted out by the Romans, namely Pompey the Great, who wasn't actually terribly interested in either Hyrcanus or in Aristobulus, but saw the conquest of Jerusalem as a chance to have a really good triumph in Rome.
And unfortunately, so the Romans, they invaded Judea of their own accord, or they were asked by one of the sides, asked them to come and to help out?
They were asked, but the Romans are always asked to come, at least according to their own account. So the Romans had a clear idea of just war, which involved that they had to be fighting when they were asked to do something, and they would always be intervening on behalf of somebody else. And that had been successful in winning them control over the whole Mediterranean world. So people kept on asking them. Obviously, they had to arrange to be asked to come and invade.
Okay, so the Romans invade. They take control. They take over, and they put Hyrcanus back in charge, and he becomes the high priest at this time. So now, how does Herod rise? Let's jump to the fact where Herod ends up rising up, and Herod becomes king, and Antipater, his father, and then his brother, they get killed, and Herod has to escape to Rome. Why don't you recap in brief that whole series of events that occurs?
Okay, so you're moving quite fast from 63 BC down to 40. And the point at which Herod entered public life himself was in 47 BC, which is the point at which the great Pompey had lost in a civil war against Julius Caesar, and had been killed. And Julius Caesar needed people to help him to raise funds. And that's the point at which Herod first came to notice to the Romans as a supporter of Hyrcanus in raising funds in Galilee. And he did it very successfully, as did his dad Antipater and his older brother Facile. So they're a sort of family operation, all working on behalf of Hyrcanus. And Hyrcanus, again, as we said, evidently trusted them. He trusted them enough to decide in 42 BCE that he wanted his granddaughter Mariamne to marry Herod, and that's quite a jump. It's an important jump for Herod. The point at which, far from being seen as an outsider, he's seen as somebody who was sufficiently important to the regime to be married into the Hasmonean family. Evidently important enough for Herod for him to send away his wife, called Doris, who he'd married a few years earlier and had a son with, who turns up later in the story. But this is a prestige marriage, and that is a major jump. It's not clear why Hyrcanus wanted Herod to marry Mariamne rather than his older brother Facile, because they were both loyal supporters of Hyrcanus. But in the end, Facile, as you said, was killed by the Parthians, opponents of the Romans. And when that happened, Herod was left as the senior son of Antipater.
And at this point, or at some point, so Herod and his father Antipater, they decide to back Julius Caesar. They flip from Pompey and they back Caesar. And this is something that occurs throughout. This will occur again with Mark Antony and with Octavian or Augustus, and I'm sure this occurred throughout the Roman world, where one patron or one person you're supporting dies or gets killed or is defeated, and then you have to flip to the other side, and you're always changing allegiances, but you have to somehow not get killed yourself, even though you flip-flopped. And this is something that Herod and Antipater were able to do with success.
They did it very successfully. As you say, everybody was having to do it. It was not a normal thing to have to do, because they were living in abnormal times. So the civil war in Rome from 49 down to 31 BC was the biggest mobilization of troops to happen in the Mediterranean world until the time of Napoleon. A huge number of soldiers were recruited from all the provinces around the Mediterranean. What they were recruited for was to support one Roman aristocrat against another. So it's extraordinarily personal. There's not a civil war about ideologies or anything sort of particularly significant. It's just a question of who within the competing Roman aristocracy was going to end up being the most important. And so before this whole breakdown in 49 BC, the beginning of the Civil War, it had been perfectly normal to be friendly with one Roman and then expect to be friendly with their successor. all Roman aristocrats who turned up in the Eastern Mediterranean represented Rome. But that was not so easy once they were fighting each other. As you say, Antipater and Herod had to change sides from Pompey to Caesar, from Caesar to Cassius, from Cassius to Mark Antony, and eventually from Mark Antony to Octavian, who became Augustus.
Yeah, and this is something that is throughout the story, and as you say, it did it with success. I think at one point with Caesar, Antigonus, or Aristobulus' son, accused Antipater of helping the other side, and they went in and they stripped off their clothing, and Antipater said, "Look at my scars that I went to battle and went to war for you," and he said, "Okay, no problem." And I think this might be later in the book. You reference this. Maybe it's when Herod switches from Mark Antony to Augustus, which was why did you make the point of why did the emperors or why did each side allow a faithful supporter of the other side to come over to them? And that's because just in general, you can keep killing everyone and have someone new come every time. And also the fact that someone was so loyal to a side, well, now that person is gone and killed and defeated, now they'll be loyal to me because they're a loyal vassal, essentially. And that's something I think it makes sense. Is that something were those like the general reasons that this happened every time, or was that unique to the Augustus situation?
Well, the claim by Herod that he would be as loyal to Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, as he had been to Antony, that's explicitly recorded, and we're told that's what he said. So it can't have been standard, otherwise to say that. Otherwise, there's no point in anybody recording it. But in practice, you're right. That's what everybody was doing, just because total regime change right across these very spread out provinces of the Eastern Mediterranean was not going to be possible. Just because Mark Antony had been defeated, you couldn't sack everybody who'd been friendly to him, because there was no bureaucracy in the Roman administration. It was very personal. And so Romans relied upon local rulers that they could use to rule on their behalf.
So Antipater and then Herod's older brother, Faisal, if I'm having his name right, or
Phasael, but
Phasael.
Yeah, but Faisal is probably the same name. Yeah.
Yeah, they both get killed. Antipater is assassinated, poisoned, and Phasael is killed. What happens to them, and what impact does their deaths have on Herod?
Well, the death of Antipater was through a poisoning by a political rival within the Jerusalem court. And that's an interesting insight, actually, a rare one, to the extent to which there was competition for this kind of role as a minister to Hyrcanus, the high priest. That Antipater wasn't the only person trying to do it, and the character who had him poisoned, a character called Malichus, was evidently looking for power for himself. Herod's response was to pretend that he didn't mind what Malichus had done and invite him to dinner, and then to ensure that Malichus was ambushed on the way to dinner by some troops, Roman troops, who'd been recruited for the purpose, and was assassinated. So he got his revenge in pretty quickly. But the poisoning of Antipater, it seemed to me, looking at Herod's later life, always worth recalling when we look at Herod's paranoia about the possibility of himself being poisoned. And it was clearly, in the ancient world, every time anybody got felt ill after a meal, it was possible to accuse somebody of poisoning. These are very difficult things to prove that you hadn't done. But the fact he'd lost his father that way might well explain a lot of the paranoia later on. The death of Fasael was through the external intervention by the enemies of the Romans, the Parthians, who had come from Iraq, and the Parthian state originally came from the Iranian highlands, but they'd got control of the whole of Mesopotamia by the mid-1st century BCE, and they took advantage of the Roman civil war to invade into northern Syria and down into the southern Levant in 40 BC. And when they did so, they got as far as Jerusalem and conquered Jerusalem. And when Fasael and Hyrcanus went to try to remonstrate with them, they were taken prisoner. And eventually, Fasael died. We have a number of different versions of how he might have died. One involved him smashing his brains out on the wall. So sort of suicide, quite difficult thing to do, actually. But other versions having him just being killed by the Parthians. But again, a disaster for Herod. These were the two men, his father and his older brother, who'd been his closest allies until 40 BC.
Now, and this was caused also, the Parthian was Antigonus making problems. Aristobulus' son, he's trying to become, king and high priest. He's trying to get back in charge, and this is something that's going to occur throughout. Is that and then so when Hyrcanus is captured, is this when they mutilate him and they make him a balmum that he can't serve as the Kohen Gadol, as the high priest anymore, and just effectively therefore remove his power?
Yes, I mean this is it's a bright idea of Antigonus. So the son of Aristobulus, therefore the grandson of Shalom Sion, that his best chance of being high priest was to make sure there couldn't be any other high priest who could be his rival. And one way of dealing with that was to have one of Hyrcanus's ears chopped off, and then Hyrcanus went off to was taken off as a hostage back to Mesopotamia by the Parthians, and that left Jerusalem under the control of the Parthians, the enemies of the Romans, led by a Hasmonean high priest who had no loyalty to the Romans. And that was the point at which Herod went off to Rome.
Yeah, Herod escapes with his younger brother, who's going to play a part in his life throughout, his wife, his family. He escapes, he leaves them, he deposits them, and he escapes out to Rome, as you say, in desperation, to seek the help of his friend Antony. And Mark Antony, I think, I don't know if you mentioned this, that had been friends with his father Antipater, so he took a liking to Herod and his family. So Herod is off to Rome in desperation. He needs to do something. He's beset by enemies. He's off to Rome to try to do what? Was it to become king, or was it just he wasn't sure at that time? Do we know what he was thinking when he leaves to Rome?
We don't know what he wanted. We do know that it's his first time that he's gone as far as Italy. I mean, it's a big journey. He went via Arabia, Nabatea, and then Egypt, where Cleopatra tried to hang on to him. And then a long sea journey, which, as often happens with sea journeys to the Mediterranean, if it's not in the right season, proved quite difficult and dangerous. But eventually got to Italy, and when he got to Italy, went to the Senate, and we're told that he didn't know what he was expecting, but the most likely thing would be that the Romans could be persuaded to come and to intervene in order to try to restore a Hasmonean, not Hyrcanus, who's got no ear and is in Parthia, but We've got one ear, but not the other ear. Herod's brother-in-law, Mariam's brother, who was very young, but was at least a Hasmonean and therefore could be a high priest, and that would be a way of trying to get the Romans back to intervene and to restore their power. But his immediate problem for Herod was that he'd left his family under the control of his of one of his brothers, Joseph. He left him in Masada, and so he left his wife, his mother, all his women folk. They're there in Masada, sort of locked up, waiting to be rescued. And so he really did need the Romans to come and do something to try to get them out.
And at that point, whether it's by surprise and he didn't intend it, or whether that's just what is told to us, or he did intend to become king, the Roman Senate, their Antony's urging, and they appoint Herod as king. And king in the Roman world, I think this is worth pointing out, is a kind of unique term. There's a king in Rome, and they appointed other positions. They had other names for that other than king. So king was kind of like the highest position they could appoint, and that's what they appointed Herod to.
Yes, so you're. I mean, it must have been a surprise of some sort, because it's very quick. He appears to be in Rome only for about a week. And he didn't know many other people in the Senate. So he appeared in front of the Senate where they would all be speaking Latin. And his language for communicating with Roman senators, including Mark Antony and Julius Caesar, will have been Greek. Romans could speak Greek, but they wouldn't do that in the Senate. They would be operating in Latin, so they wouldn't quite understand what they were talking about. And the normal Roman practice was always to appoint rulers from the existing ruling family. They'd done that for generations when interfering in other communities, other countries. But the idea they'd take somebody who came as an outsider, make him a king over Judea, that was not at all normal. And the reason for them doing it is they were in the middle of a civil war. So they needed somebody with a bit of energy who might be able to try to get back control over Judea, which was currently in enemy hands. So not so easy to do it without forces at his disposal.
And the fact that they proclaimed him king, as opposed to, I think, is it tetrarch, the other position that they end up appointing his son later on? That's the more common rather than king, right?
Yeah, there were lots of provincial kings, client kings, friendly kings, as the Romans called them, in different parts of the empire. But they were very clear that you're right. The title king is kept to show that somebody's really quite important. So Hyrcanus had not been a king from 63 BCE when Pompey conquered Jerusalem. He was high priest, but he couldn't be king. And on the death of Herod, the same thing's going to happen again. That the use of the term king is kept to demonstrate that somebody is really been given quite a lot of authority. And it's important in Roman society precisely because Romans didn't have a king. They had a king once upon a time, and they remembered it as a time from of the distant past. Which they could never get back to. They were very impressed by kings, precisely because they hadn't got a king of their own.
At this, and especially at that point, they didn't even have not a king. There wasn't a Caesar. Augustus yet was not Caesar, so there was still the Senate was still in control, and there was still the fighting, etc. We'll get to that a little bit shortly. So Herod, now freshly anointed king, he returns. His brother Joseph is killed somewhere in the fighting and the skirmishes, and there's this constant squabbling. Anyone who's read Josephus is familiar with all the names and the familiar names, and it's killing one after the next is what's going on in the region. And Herod recaptures Jerusalem. He's back And as you say, he's worried, he doesn't want to destroy. It's not a question of him retaking it. He will. He has the Roman Empire on his side. It's just an issue of he doesn't want to destroy the city, which unfortunately will happen in the Churban Beis Hamikdash. Will happen later on. Not that far later from this time when they destroy the Beis Hamikdash, which we'll get to. Herod building it up to the grand building that it was. But at this time, Herod retakes it. What happens at this time to Antigonus, Aristobulus' son, who the kind of Herod's enemy, who's still left hanging around in the area?
Yes, and Antigonus did not do well. Once the city had been conquered, Jerusalem was captured by Roman forces under the command of the Roman governor and general Sosius, in whose eyes this was just an ordinary standard Roman victory. So Sosius had a triumph through the streets of Rome in 34 BC, three years later. It's his big victory. He doesn't see it as Herod's victory. Yeah, so Herod's main job was to make sure that the Roman troops didn't do what they were normally expected to do in at least the 24 hours after the end of a siege, which was a full license to plunder and loot and destroy. It was an important part of the way in which Roman military discipline was kept, was to allow that kind of license to troops once they'd had a victory. It was expected. And to stop that, they had to be bribed very heavily by Herod. He didn't have the money, so it was promises of future bribes. But it seems to have worked sufficiently that the city wasn't destroyed altogether when conquered on his behalf. But he's obviously frightened by the idea that Antigonus looked like a much more plausible ruler over Judea as a Hasmonean than he did. And when Antigonus was sent off to Roman captivity, Herod ensured that he would end up being executed. He wasn't safe being left alive. It seems to be quite explicit that he just couldn't trust the Romans not to notice that actually Antigonus was a much more normal sort of ruler for them to hand over control to than he was. And Antigonus was quite well known to quite a lot of Roman aristocrats. He spent a lot of time in Rome, a lot more than Herod.
So at this point, Herod needs to find a high priest. He needs a Kohen Gadol. So he decides what I guess from a ruler's point of view makes sense to, even though his wife now, as you said, Mariami was a Chashmonaim, was one of the Chashmonai, so she was a Hasmonean, but he decides he's going to move away from that family. He's going to give power to somebody else. As you see this, kings, you want to take someone that's not going to be your rival. So he picks someone, Babylonian, picks someone from Bavel, and he says, I'm going to overstep them. Now, naturally, the Chashmonaim are furious. Obviously, Hyrcanus can't be, so you're left with Hyrcanus' wife, I believe, was upset it didn't go to her son, Jonathan Aristobulus, and Yochanan Aristobulus. He is 17, and she lobbies Cleopatra. So you always have these foreign influences coming in throughout the story. And this is always going to be the story of Herod's life throughout. And this is the story of any kingdom, essentially, any state that's under control of another one. But this is what happens at the time, and Cleopatra eventually forces the young Yochanan Aristobulus to become high priest, and this doesn't sit well with Herod, and this doesn't end well for the young high priest, and this seemingly comes at Herod's hand. I mean, do we know definitively that it does? It seemingly does.
No, we don't know definitively. But what happened to Jonathan Aristobulus was that he was invited to go to the palace in Jericho and went swimming. And they had a game of some kind, which involved holding him underwater longer than was sensible. And he ended up drowning. And Herod claimed it was a terrible accident. Anything is possible. But it's clear that Jonathan Aristobulus' mother, who is Alexandra, who is also Herod's mother-in-law, that she didn't believe for a moment that there was an accident, and she tried to get her friend Cleopatra to persuade Cleopatra's paramour, Mark Antony, that two of them are living together and having children together. Tried to persuade Mark Antony as the most powerful Roman in the East in the 30s BCE, tried to persuade him to have Herod removed and punished for this murder. The response of Antony is actually sort of interesting, that Romans shouldn't go intervening with the way in which kings rule their kingdom. A thing that kings have to do is every now and again have people killed. And so it's not appropriate to intervene at that level. And in terms of ordinary Roman rule, that was true. That was true. They tended to leave kings up to do their own, to rule their kingdoms as they thought fit.
Yeah, and this, this constant now political intrigue is going to be going back and forth, and it really reads like a real life Game of Thrones political intrigue is what happens in this time period, and it doesn't get any better. Is when Herod heads off to Mark Antony, and at some point he leaves orders that Mariamne should be put to death if he's not there, and then she gets wind of this, of course, is furious, and as it is, he's suspected of having killed her brother, and her mother is fuming. And at this point, his uncle, who had been left, Joseph, was in charge. So Herod decides that Joseph must have had an affair with Mariamne. He killed Joseph. I mean, it gets worse and worse, or better and better, whichever way you want to say it. It's just the story for the story purpose. I mean, it's crazy, Herod's life, and it's only going to get. I mean, he seems to be completely off the wall paranoid. Maybe it was justified, maybe not. You see some of his actions, which I guess would plausibly lead to people wanting to have him killed or doing things behind his back. But this is what eventually happens. And so these things go back and forth. And I don't know, I want to jump again, but maybe to jump to Mariamne's unfortunate demise and her execution at the hands of her husband, Herod.
Yes, I mean, Herod's life does divide, his rule divides between the period when his main problem is what to do about the Hasmonean link, which he tried to bring in on his side through his marriage to Mariamne, so to give himself some kind of authority among Jews by being married to Mariamne. And it wasn't working too well, and eventually in 29 BC, he suspected her of treason, put her on trial, and had her executed. And fairly soon after, had her mother, Alexandra, again accused of treason, and again also executed. So that there were no leading Hasmoneans around to challenge him. And it was not irrational, actually, that given that he'd come to power in this very odd way through the support of the Roman Senate, at a time when the Roman Senate was sort of not thinking straight. It was, the whole Roman world was in a mess. It wasn't obvious they'd want to keep somebody like Herod in power, as opposed to a ruler who had a natural authority within the community over which they were ruling, which was their normal practice. So it was reasonable for him to be paranoid about Hasmoneans, and not least Hasmonean women. After all, Shalom Sion had ruled as a queen in her own right. And Herod was spending his time in the 30s trying to deal with another very powerful queen, Cleopatra. So the idea that either Mariamne might rule in her own right or her mother Alexandra was not crazy in terms of the way that Hellenistic kingdoms, meaning the kind of kingdoms in the Near East which were like the Hasmonean state by the first century BCE. It was not unreasonable for them to expect these women to seek power in their own right. So of course, it's a rather drastic way of dealing with it, to have them put on trial and put to death. But it did deal with it. And it means that once Mariamne and Alexandra were dead, it ceased to be a problem for Herod worrying about a potential Hasmonean coup. And he began to rule in a rather different way.
Yeah, and now at this point, things come to a head between Mark Antony and Octavian, and this culminates in the Battle of Actium, and Antony and Cleopatra their forces are routed, and Antony and Cleopatra flee, and eventually they're killed, and then Augustus comes to power, and this is when Herod flips again. Luckily for him, due to other fighting, he had been absent at the actual battle, so he was able to really flip-flop and head over to Octavian, who becomes the Emperor Augustus, who takes him in, and they have really a lifelong relationship. Augustus outlives Herod, and they really come with a... what is their relationship like, and what is that like? Because that has extreme importance for the rest of the story.
It does. It became clear after the Battle of Actium, when Octavian became sole ruler of the Roman world, that he was going to stay as sole ruler of the Roman world and was not going to share power in the way that had been absolutely standard in the history of the Roman Republic for the previous 500 years. So getting on well with the new ruler was going to be immensely important. And Herod doesn't seem to have known Augustus closely in personal terms. They spent time together on a series of occasions. First, when Augustus Octavian, as he still was in Egypt just after the Battle of Actium. Spent a considerable amount of time together then, and accompanied Octavian back all the way up north to Syria, sort of looking after him on the way, and then visited him a couple of times in Rome later on in his reign. But the really close relationship was with Augustus's right-hand man, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. And Agrippa was the general who'd won all Augustus's victories. So Augustus was a good politician, but a terrible general. But fortunately, he had this close friend who was really good as a general and did not have independent ambitions. Partly because he did not come from a sufficiently aristocratic background. And Agrippa does seem to have become very close to Herod. And they saw one another quite a lot in the late 20s and the teens BCE until Agrippa's early death in 12 BCE. But it's not accidental that later members of Herod's family are called Agrippa. So no, we think of it as a Jewish name, of course, it's going to turn up in the Mishnah, but it's not. It's very much an Italian name.
Yeah, and that name, as you say, not for sure, but most probably comes from this Agrippa. I want to just go back for a second, just mention something I forgot to mention. We talked about the execution of Hasmonean. So Herod also, before he kills Mariamne, part of that, he kills Hyrcanus. So he kills him himself, Mariamne's grandfather. So he's effectively killed her whole family, so it's no wonder that she's furious with him. But he does have two sons with her, and we'll get to them later and what happens to them. So there are the Chashmonaim line continues through Herod, and we'll return to that. But let's turn a little bit to Herod, and how Herod rules his kingdom now after he puts Mariamne to death, and he's fully in charge under Antony's patronage. What happens to his kingdom? As we know, I assume as we know, I should say, clearly Herod is a tremendous builder, and he does many things in the land of Israel, which we still have today. Obviously, he builds up the Beis Hamikdash, which Chazal say, Kol Shalei Ra Binyan heard this Yamav Ra Binyan. No, you didn't. I'm not sure if I make exactly perfect the quote, but if you didn't see a beautiful building, you didn't see Herod's Beis Hamikdash, you didn't see a beautiful building ever, and he builds this massive Beis Hamikdash. He obviously does the Maras HaMachpelah in Hebron. He does Masada, and there's also countless pagan or non-Jewish things that he builds up as well. He names things after his patrons. He had named the fortress Antonia after Mark Antony, and he ends up building Caesarea after Caesar, which is Octavian. He builds that city, and he builds many more things. So I want you to discuss all these a little bit, but just where did this come from? That he is this tremendous and terrific builder, building up, many things throughout Israel.
So it is because he's living in a time of change within the wider Roman world. So if we look at what was going on in Rome in exactly the same period, Augustus proclaiming the end of the civil war, proclaiming peace, which had come about, of course, in practice because he'd ended up killing so many people to end up being sole ruler. Once he was sole ruler, he wanted a new age, the rebuilding of Rome as a brand new city that was brick, and he was going to turn into a city of marble. And this kind of celebration of the new era, the new regime, that's what Herod was plugging into. He does seem to have been the first provincial ruler to build a temple to Roman Augustus already in 27 BCE. And the name Augustus was only given to Augustus in January of 27 BCE. But Herod was building this special temple to worship him, a pagan temple, of course, in the city of Sebaste in Samaria. Sebaste is the Greek for Augustus. So he's renamed the city extraordinarily early. I think what one could see, all this sort of monumental building being a sort of celebration of the new regime.
Obvious question that arises is, where did Herod get all the money for this?
Well, with difficulty, but a part of it will have come from taxation from his subjects. We know that when he died, one of the complaints was overtaxation. But then, of course, that's standard. The people always complain about being overtaxed. He was given a number of concessions by Augustus. So the copper mines of Cyprus, he was allowed to take the concession of exploiting them, and tax collection in Syria and in parts of Asia Minor. We don't know quite how he managed that, but the standard expectation was anybody in charge of collecting taxes in the Roman world would make a profit from it, a considerable profit. So there were a number of sort of side hustles that Herod seems to have had that were given to him by the emperor to enable him to raise money. But he does seem to have been spending money on prestige projects at the same time as taking money from other people. So he was always juggling, annoying one set of subjects in order to please another, or more importantly, to please the Romans.
And by the way, the exact quote is Gemara Babasra, Misha le'ra binyan hordas le'ra binyan nomi yama. If anyone didn't see the building of Hordas, so Herod didn't see a beautiful building in his days. The other thing is, and you already mentioned, he did obviously these grand Jewish buildings, but he also did pagan ones. And how he answered that is something that, a question. And also he put the eagle, kind of the Roman eagle, which was a symbol of idolatry of a Zara, I guess it was viewed as, and this was kind of a fight that went on throughout Herod's life by the Beis Hamikdash. This was kind of not a smart idea, and something he should not have done, but he did it anyways. So that is one other thing that Herod did, and something else. I don't know if you want to discuss that as well before we get to, as well as just in general, the high priest, something we had mentioned earlier. So he kind of killed out a lot of the Hasmoneans. He didn't want anyone in a position to oppose him. So he ends up appointing some outsider from Babylon again. And he puts up, he says, let's just remove this whole thing from the Chashmonaim, for the Hasmoneans. There's going to be no one that's going to oppose me. And he really was, brutal in the regard of that. Anyone that he thought was going to have any sort of competition for him, he just killed or had put to death.
Yeah, or we don't know much about them. I mean, there must have been plenty of people who just sort of stayed in the background. There is a fairly clear distinction, actually, between the building of pagan temples, which he built in areas where there were not Jewish populations. So these are for his pagan subjects. And he's quite unapologetic about it, actually. We have a speech put into his mouth by historian Josephus, which must come from Herod's court historian Nicolaus of Damascus, in which Herod said, look, he's sorry for having to do this, but it was important as a way of staying on the good side of the Romans, and staying on the good side of the Romans was really helpful for the Jews. So is it all in terms of realpolitik? The temple in Jerusalem, I think it's more complicated than thinking of it as another expression of Herod getting his Judaism wrong. And Judaism was very varied in this period, so there are lots of different ideas of exactly the right way in which you should worship. And as you could see from the Talmud, the main rebuilding of the temple went down really well, and it was a huge operation. So it's an oddity, actually, that Herod didn't put his name on his buildings. He didn't put his name on any of his buildings, either the Jewish or the non-Jewish ones. So we call it Herod's Temple, but he could have put an inscription up, which was a standard thing to do right across the Greek and Roman world in his time, a very, very normal thing to do, but he didn't. And it doesn't look as if he thought the eagle that he put up above the pediment of the temple was a problem, and it had been there a long time. But before it was pulled down just before Herod died. So it's quite possible that most other Jews also thought it was an okay thing to do. Was it a symbol of Rome? Actually, not obviously. There were various symbols of Rome on Roman coins, but although the eagles were used by Roman legions, the use of an eagle as to symbolize the state isn't a standard thing to do. So it's interesting to try to guess what it was, the point of this eagle. It definitely cost a lot of money. It was gold, so presumably it had been. It won't be pure gold, but it would be a statue of some kind with a gold covering. But it was meant, as Herod said, as an act of piety. So he thought it was an offering, and there were lots of strange things in the temple, which surprises one when you read the descriptions in Josephus. And this would just been another one. So I think he thought what he was doing was a really good thing to do, and presumably he didn't have good enough information coming back from the wider Jewish population to know that there were some people who seriously objected to it. And he found out just a few weeks before he died.
Now, that's something else worth discussing. As you mentioned, there were different factions at the time. You had the Pharisees, the Essenes, the Sadducees. And so what was Herod's relationship with these various groups?
Well, we're told he liked the Essenes because an Essene had prophesied that he would become king. So he was really impressed by their prophetic abilities. And that he put up with the Pharisees because members of his court, particularly women within his court, pleaded on their behalf when they didn't want to take an oath of loyalty to him. So Essenes were allowed not to take an oath of loyalty to Herod on the grounds they never took any oaths. The Pharisees said, we don't want to take an oath in case we decide to break it. And Herod quite sensibly thought, well, jolly good reason for making them take the oath of loyalty in that case, because they won't break it. Then they'll stay loyal. so he wasn't impressed by the argument, but they were fined, and the fine was paid by the women within the court. We don't know anything about Sadducees as a group in Herod's time at all, interestingly. It seems unlikely that Herod had much interest in the different groups within Judaism. The Judaism that he knew was the Judaism of the temple. So it's the public celebration of the festivals and of the new moons and the Sabbaths and the pilgrimage festivals, and the private domestic way in which you ate. So whether Herod always ate kosher, I have no idea, and I doubt. But there was no point in people making jokes about him not eating pig, if he was known actually to have no interest in dietary laws at all. I'm about to say he certainly took circumcision seriously, because he wouldn't let members of his female members of his family marry non-Jews unless they underwent circumcision.
And what you're referring to with the pig quote is a quote attributed to Augustus, who said, "I would rather be Herod's pig than be his son," or something to that effect. And essentially, because a pig obviously is not a Jew can't eat pig, eating kosher, but killing his family, Herod did that routinely. And so this is something that chapter 5 of your book opens with a quote from Josephus. In his family life, he was a paradigm of misfortune. And I guess misfortune is a way of putting it. He brought upon a lot of these tragedies himself, whether justified or not by his suspicion. He still was brutal, and he killed many people, but had many of his family put to death. And as we'll get to, we didn't get to Miriam and his 2 sons, who he eventually has executed, his own 2 sons who would have succeeded him. And this is, we already mentioned, he has Miriam killed, he has his mother-in-law killed, he has her brother killed, he has Hyrcanus killed, he has Antigonus killed. I mean, he has everybody's killed, essentially put to death. This is only his family, besides anyone else, that he has got countless people put to death. Interestingly, his brother Pheroras, if I'm pronouncing this right, who kind of spurns his hand in marriage a bunch of times, he doesn't do anything. He does not kill his brother, his own brother. Maybe he didn't go killing his siblings, that the other ones had been killed. But let's talk about his family and what happens to his family, and how brutal he was to his family, and his 2 sons, and etc. As we get towards the latter part of his life.
Yes, it requires a certain amount of empathy. One thing that we're told actually on a number of places about him was that he was extraordinarily fond of his family. And the 2 things do go together, actually, that he is a highly emotional character. It doesn't do to think of Herod as a calm, calculating, vicious tyrant. He's very intense. His relationship to this brother Pheroras, described by Josephus with the term Philadelphotatos. He is very fond of his brother. It's a very unusual Greek term. It means he went over the top in his fondness for his brother. This sort of close family relationship runs right actually through the whole of his career. That all the time there are members of his family who he's relying on, and then when things go wrong, he gets really upset, and that's the point at which, as you say, he gets so upset. Some of them end up dying. But what is I try to argue in the book. Is that the deaths that outsiders remembered, which led to the quote attributed to Augustus, are just the ones at the very end. They're the sons. And these are the 2 sons by Mariamne, who were both executed in 7 BCE. And then his eldest son, by Doris, who'd been brought back into the court as a counterweight to the sons by Mariamne in 14 BC, that Antipater was also finally put to death just before Herod's own death. Why was it that the wider world knew about these sons? And the answer is that it was very, very public in the wider Roman world that all these executions happened after trials in front of either the Roman emperor or in front of a Roman governor. And so they were celebrated cases that the Sunday newspapers would write about, or the equivalent in the Roman world. Everybody knew about this sort of exotic relationships that were going on. And Herod would appear in front of the court and burst into tears and say, I don't want to kill my sons. And the judge would say, either the emperor or the governor, well, don't, we'll have to find a way of reconciling you to each other. So it's the publicity to it that makes this different from other kings who also kill their sons. And it's also the case that the Hasmoneans have terrible things that some of them did within the family. But the later tradition doesn't remember in quite the same way. So it's the public nature in the wider Roman world that's what I think lies behind the reputation that Herod was to get for being so horrible to his family.
Yeah, and as you go through this greater in depth, and his two sons by Mariamne, they were raised by Augustus or with Augustus. They were in Rome for a while. Augustus knew them well. He tried to reconcile them. They went to Rome for one of the trials at one point, and it doesn't end well for them. They end up executed, as you say. Antipater ends up executed at the end of Herod's life, and so Antipater, his son, Antipater. So this really doesn't end up well for his family, and this is, like you say, quite public, and you discuss this at length. What about Herod's own demise, own death? There's a couple of things there. He's kind of in really bad shape. There's kind of a brutal death. He's really unwell, if you can talk about that. And then there's the legend, or is it the fact, where he allegedly wanted all the leading class, a lot of the country, brought together to one big Colosseum, and he gave orders that they should all be killed on the spot. And that wasn't carried out. That didn't happen. They kind of chickened out. His brother? Talk about the end and Herod's demise, and then what happens after Herod, who takes him over.
Yeah, his death evidently was very painful. He was old. Given I'm the same kind of age, it doesn't feel that old, but it was old in those days. And it was evidently some kind of awful disease that left him in a great deal of pain. And so he was down by Jericho, his physicians trying to give him different kinds of ways of relieving the pain, and it sort of didn't work. But one of the things that was worrying him was that people would not mourn when he died. He'd made a lot of preparations for his funeral, of which the most impressive was the building of Herodium. So his tomb in Herodium, at a special site which marked the place where he'd won a battle right back in 40 BCE, at the time when he was just in the process of becoming ruler of Judea, very early in his career. And so to mark that place, they have the artificial mound, which had then been turned into a great burial chamber, in which, of course, the tombs were discovered, it was about now 15 years or so ago. And the whole process of him being carried in procession from Jericho up to Herodium all seems to have been put into operation. He knew what was going to happen, but it was only going to really work if people were going to, if his subjects would join in and to show that they were sorry that he died. So the story is that he asked his sister and brother-in-law, Salome, could she ensure that a large number of leading Jews be gathered together in the Hippodrome and put to death when his death was announced, and at least the population would be crying for somebody. Like many unfulfilled plans, you never know whether this was a real plan or not, because we're told that Salome decided against it when the time came. So we don't know, but you can see why such a story might grow up, and perfectly reasonable to think that there were indeed large numbers of Jews being gathered together in the Hippodrome as they were awaiting news of whether the king was dying, because it was clear that he was in his very last days.
So Herod dies, and Herod had killed off many of his sons, many of his descendants. So who was left to take over Herod's kingdom, and what happened?
He's still got quite a lot of sons left. And this in some ways is one of the most curious things about Herod's later rule, is that after the death of Mariamne in 29 BCE, originally he had a breakdown, a sort of emotional breakdown. Seems to have been incapable of doing anything very much. But when he pulled himself together, he, after a number of months, he began recreating a family, and he did so with multiple marriages. And so in 7 BCE, he was living with 9 different wives. And this is surprising, because we're told very explicitly by Josephus that Herod did this because this is a Jewish custom, which Herod took advantage of. But it's not actually a Jewish custom that anybody else was taking advantage of in the first century BCE. Hasmoneans married one wife at a time. Romans marry one wife at a time. It is true there's other evidence for bigamy in Herod's time, say for 2 wives, but 9 wives, we don't have anything like that at all anywhere. So it's a slightly surprising thing that he was doing it, and these wives produced sons who then competed for the attention of their father as to whether they could become the new king on his death. And so when Herod died, there were actually 3 sons, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip, 2 by one of Herod's wife, the Samaritan Malfaki, and 1 by Cleopatra of Jerusalem, that's Philip. They all went off to Rome and tried to persuade the emperor that their father's wishes should be fulfilled, which eventually they sort of were, although Archelaus, who became ruler of Judea, became ruler as an ethnarch, meaning a people ruler, rather than as king, and with the proviso that he could become king when he showed he was good enough at doing it. And it turned out after 10 years he was not good enough at doing it, and he was sent off into exile in the south of France. And that's the point at which direct Roman rule over Judea began.
Although we end up having Herod's grandson, Agrippa, there's a first, and then there's Agrippa the second during the Khurban as well, during the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, right? So you have later on continuation of that. Now, what is Herod's kind of, we've discussed here towards at the end, kind of alluded to Herod being remembered as this brutal butcher of his family. Because this is so public, he's known of this more than other kings and emperors. But what is Herod's kind of legacy? Has always been, and then we can also talk about Herod's legacy by the Christians. We'll give a minute to that. That's something you discuss in the book at the end of the book. But what's Herod's general legacy throughout history, today and throughout?
I mean, within the Jewish tradition, there's remarkably little. I mean, if you look in the rabbinic tradition, there's not much said about Herod at all. Not much said about the last Hasmoneans either, actually. A bit about Yana, a bit about Shalom Sion, but otherwise not very much. It's sort of like a sort of forgotten period, and it's only with the transfer of the Josephus narrative into part of the Hebrew account of the Second Temple period in Yosippon, which is the 10th century CE in Italy, probably. It's only then that Jews start becoming sort of really aware of anything of this wider history. And then they're a bit ambivalent about him, actually. The Jews don't really think of him as the great Jewish king. So it's clear that Herod very much wanted to be remembered. And we're told that explicitly. That's one of the reasons he did all this building. Of course, he is sort of remembered, but not necessarily the way that he would have liked to be remembered. It seems interesting to me that he's not really remembered by Jews as a great Jewish king at all. It's quite possible that the multiple marriages was an attempt. Now he couldn't be a sort of Hasmonean type figure because there were no Hasmoneans left. And he sort of imitated Solomon in the rebuilding of the temple. That actually what he's trying to do is to make himself a bit like David. Sort of quite striking action quite late in his life was the rebuilding of the tomb of David in Jerusalem, which was a major landmark, rebuilt in about 10 BC, just quite close towards the end of Herod's life. So I do speculate on the possibility that he's trying to present himself to Jews as a sort of an impressive king on the lines of David, not a messianic figure, but just as a David type king. If so, it doesn't entirely work. So when we come to find versions of Yosippon's history, which is very popular in the Middle Ages and the early modern period in lots of different translations to different languages. He's portrayed as if he's a non-Jewish king.
Now, what about Herod's legacy in the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel today?
There was a sort of shift there when the tomb at Herodion was found. Within sort of wider Zionist accounts of Herod, there were different versions of him, either as the king who managed to successfully manipulate the wider power of Rome for the benefit of Jews, or as a traitor who had betrayed the Jews to the Romans, and who should be treated as a traitor and denigrated. And you get that actually already in the 19th century when the Wissenschaft des Judentums historians began writing about Herod. They took these two very different views, and they both go alongside each other. And sometimes you get amongst some of the Israeli historians people who have just changed their minds. So it seems to be the case for the great historian Abraham Shalit, who'd been writing about Herod for most of his life, and became much more favorable to him later in his life, in a way which didn't quite accord with the sort of the standard Israeli school curriculum. He became Shalit's history, which is still the classic, huge volumes of studies, nonetheless has a evaluation which hasn't carried the field altogether. But Herod as a builder, really, I think in modern Israel, Israelis only really began to recognize quite how much he'd done when the Herodian excavations were were published, and there was a great exhibition in the Israel Museum, which got a lot of interest. It's in about 2010, I think.
And we still see Herod's impact today for anyone who has been to Israel or lives there, is that with the Kaisel, the Western Wall, and with the Maras HaMachpelah in Hebron, and with Masada, and with Yosef Herodium, all these things, you still see his impact as a builder all these years later. So you still see that. One other thing worth touching on briefly that you mentioned at the end of the book, this is not a Christian podcast, but you do mention that in his legacy in Christianity is very negative, and as you point out, as you say in your book, is mistaken.
Almost certainly. His wider legacy in Western culture comes through the gospel accounts of his alleged attempt to prevent the birth of Jesus by having all the children aged under 2 in the area around Bethlehem put to death when he heard that there was a son of David as a king who'd just been born there. It's in the Gospel of Matthew. And what the Gospel of Matthew seems to be doing is to produce essentially a midrash on the Exodus story of Pharaoh. And there's a reverse Exodus in which the family of Jesus' parents went down into Egypt to escape from the wicked king. So Herod is like a wicked Pharaoh. And in later Christian art, that is how it's often portrayed. So the massacre of the innocents is widely portrayed in later Christian art. Also in plays and in operas and elsewhere. It doesn't help that in the later Christian tradition, the name Herod was also applied to his sons and his grandsons, including Agrippa, who you referred to. Even though Agrippa, we know what he called himself, and he did not call himself Herod. He called himself Marcus Julius Agrippa, so it's a good Roman name. King of, as the great king. And we have a number of inscriptions from Athens in which his full name was given. So he didn't use the name Herod, quite sensibly, because his brother did have the name Herod as his first name. So if they want to distinguish themselves, one was called Agrippa, another one was called Herod.
Being that this podcast is, although we're recording this, a couple of weeks before, but this is going to be planned release during the 3 weeks. So what impact does Herod have on the destruction, the Churban Beis Hamikdash? This occurs after his death, almost 70 years. And you wrote a whole book on this, Roman Jerusalem. You have a book dedicated to that subject. So that's not the focus of this podcast episode. But, I mean, what impact does it have? And we see, despite Herod's reign and all the things that happened that we've discussed here and much more discussed in your book, there was he had control, I guess, for during his life. I mean, at the beginning, there was obviously back and forth, a lot of killing, but he had control of Israel during his time. But later on, it kind of fell apart. Is that one of his, maybe some of that was his fault, maybe it wasn't? Is that part of his impact? Or is it something else? What is his impact that you can see on the destruction and the revolt and the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash?
There is a link. I mean, he yes, he kept control over his kingdom, largely through brutality and fear, but successfully. And one piece of evidence for that was the chaos on his death in 4 BC, extraordinary chaos, which had to be dealt with by Roman legions marching south from Antioch in Syria in order to restore control in Jerusalem. And that is the War of Varus, which crops up occasionally in rabbinic sources. So yes, here was evidence that to keep all the different tensions under control in Judea did require very strong leadership. And once you didn't have strong leadership, things went wrong. The most direct link for the Churban is the role of Herod's great-grandson, Agrippa II. So if we look at the very detailed account of what happened as the lead up to the destruction of the temple, the outbreak of revolt in 66 CE, leading to the destruction 4 years later in 70, the person who had the responsibility for running the temple, appointing high priests, and ensuring order in the temple in the period from 52 CE down to the outbreak of revolt in 66 was Agrippa II. He'd been given that role by the Roman Emperor Claudius, and then by Nero. So it was his responsibility to make sure that the high priests were appointed and they would keep control of the temple, and they didn't. Agrippa II ended up on the Roman side while the temple of Jerusalem was being besieged, with his sister Berenice living with the Roman general Titus. They'd basically swapped sides. And so trying to get this balance between being pro-Roman and pro-Jewish, which Herod sort of managed, proved too difficult for Agrippa II.
Okay, so that's kind of the life of Herod and his impact, as we could fit in an hour and a half. There's much more in the book. The book, I will say I read the entire book. It's very readable, not long, and a little more than 200 pages. It's like the other books in the Jewish Lives series. It's meant for, I think it's meant, you can correct me if I'm wrong, a general public, and it's written very, it's very, very readable and while being scholarly at the same time. You have some maps in the front. You also have a chart that has money in line. You have a tree that have the family of Herod. You have a chronology in the back, a detailed chronology. There are a couple of appendices, and you talk about Josephus' two narratives and so on. And obviously, I will assume that one of the big sources you use is Josephus, and you do mention that it comes from Nicholas Damascus, I think, that's where Josephus gets a lot of his. So, first of all, I'll link the book in the show's notes for anyone that would like to purchase it. It's around the $20 mark. It's for hardcover. Like all the Jewish Lives books, they're very affordable. And I'll also link the Oxford edition of Josephus for those interested in the Josephus is the Jewish War, the Oxford World Classics edition that you, Professor Goodman, you did the notes and the introduction there, and that's the also like $14 thereabouts around on Amazon for the paperback, but it's quite affordable. And for those that want to read it, it's something, especially this time of year when this podcast is being posted, I always recommend that, and it's something you can really see a lot of what goes on. So I will link to those two books in the show's notes for those interested and can check them out. And thank you, Professor Goodman, for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's been very interesting.